Yeah. So Alexander, please.
Okay. So hello again. Now I'm speaking on my own behalf. Makes it a little bit easier. So you can see my slides, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so if you look at the title of my talk, you can see that I tried actually to adopt a little bit different perspective here, to look at things not just from the point of view of a TRIZ professional, but actually bring in another perspective, that of education professional, because I think that depending on the point of view, we have a different default position. Let me tell you a little bit maybe about my background and why I believe I can swap the points of view. So I belong to that generation of people who started learning TRIZ when I was still a child, at the end of 1980s, when it was the first big wave of teaching TRIZ to children. I came to a first adult TRIZ conference when I was 14. I've been a certified TRIZ specialist for quite a long time since this certification appeared. And I actually started applying TRIZ, or more specifically AutoSM TRIZ, to education since 1997. So I've been doing things for quite some time. And I've also been doing things for quite some time in education as such. I actually started teaching on a more or less regular basis when I was 16. I started teaching TRIZ actually as a class in school when I was 17. I was still a student in another school and I started teaching it in a different school. From 19, I started working as a regular teacher. So it was still the 90s, the transitional period in the former Soviet Union. So things were possible back then, which are no longer possible. My PhD is in education, and I've been working as an expert in education for international organizations such as UNESCO and UNICEF and World Bank for quite some time. So I see education systems in different countries from the inside. I go to the classrooms and I know how things look like. So having these two different sides of the background, I believe I can try to speak about both points of view and discuss in what way our views may be different depending on the point of view. And I think that the first difference is a different default position. A default position of a TRIZ professional is that TRIZ is a value in itself, and that when we bring it to education, it's already useful and the whole world is going to benefit from this. The position of education professional is quite different because, let's be honest, TRIZ is something very small, especially when we go to the English-speaking world, so virtually not known in the field of education. And when we speak about it, in any case, it is an investment. And again, those of us who professionally deal with TRIZ, we know that TRIZ is difficult. So if we actually want to master it, it's quite of an investment. And if we decide to make this investment, we have to be clear about the returns. Normally, I think it's always a good tradition, at least in TRIZ culture, when we start discussing something, is to discuss it on different screens of what we refer to as a multi-screen scheme of thinking or system operator. We don't have the time to really look at education through multi-screen, although I think it will be actually a very useful thing to do. But let me highlight a few screens which I believe would be useful in our discussion of TRIZ and education. So the first screen is where we're discussing where it comes from. When you read about TRIZ or when you listen to different people speak about TRIZ in education, you can actually hear different answers to these questions. So where TRIZ education or TRIZ pedagogy or whatever term is being used, so where it comes from. So some people believe that it actually comes from the time when Altshuler and his followers started teaching TRIZ to engineers. So the fact of teaching TRIZ is the beginning of TRIZ education. There are people who speak about the beginning when TRIZ started, well, actively being taught to children. So basically the second part of 1980s. And the person who was probably one of the first who started doing it is Igor Vikentiev. During 1990s, quite a few people starting teaching TRIZ in formal education systems. What I would like to refer to as one of the screens is actually not the real world, but the fictional world. And this is the fictional world, and more specifically, one of the publications, science fiction publications of Genrich Altschuler, which is called The Third Millennium, where he introduced the metaphor of universal professionals. And actually the topic of education is quite distinct in that particular, well, it's not really a novel, but in that particular story. So he speaks about education, a specific education model and specific education approach. And actually the idea of people who can solve problems is very much relevant to what we discuss in TRIZ education. Another screen which I would like to highlight is already the 90s. The 90s, especially the end of 1990s, is the time when in the TRIZ community, people started seriously reflect on TRIZ in education. Meaning not only on what we are doing when we bring TRIZ to education, but also on how it relates to what is going on in education. There were different things. So Alena Sterenko, who you could hear a little bit earlier, she published a paper, I think it was in 1999, when she spoke about the things we're doing in education. A little bit later, there was an article by Ingrida Murashkovska, a number of papers, so basically about 20 years ago, and many of them referred to what Nikolai sometime before formulated as a driving contradiction, which nowadays in this or that way is basically referred to in lots of publications in education. And the idea of preparing people for tomorrow, we don't have any idea about. And the third screen I would like to refer to is already the screen which comes from the world of education. And this is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and their 2030 framework. We referred to Sustainable Development Goals a little bit earlier in the chat, and actually what OECD is doing very much relates to both agendas, so the agenda of changes in education and changes in the world, and the Learning Compass, which you can actually find, and I will also have a slide later on. The metaphor introduced by OECD speaks about learning to navigate the rapidly changing ecosystem to help the learner change the future. So in a sense, the modern education, at least at the policy level, is very much adopting the rhetoric which has been going on in TRIZ community regarding the ideas in education. So it's no longer something specific to the TRIZ community at the level of mainstream education, at least at the policy level it is being discussed. There was also a comment earlier today in the chat that open-ended problems is something education is speaking about. And I completely agree. Everybody is speaking about it. It's not unique to TRIZ community, obviously. In fact, if we speaking about ongoing reforms in education, there are quite a few things which are emphasized all the time. Some of them is about establishing connections to lives outside school. It's about developing core competencies, including thinking. So everyone is discussing development of thinking in education. We also speaking about reducing the gap between what we intend to do, so the policy level, and between what is actually going on in the classroom and what learners acquire. So there is a permanent process of reflection, and those international tools, which all of us have heard about, like PISA and Teams and Pearls, they all are about helping education system around the world to reduce this gap. So what I'm trying to say that problems and some of the problems which we are referring to when we speak about TRIZ and education, they're also being solved by the mainstream education system. So we are not like two different camps. So we are living within this super system, and we have to accept that they're also working and doing lots of things. So let me give you a few examples. So the first example is about mainstream education actually embedding thinking into what is going on. So what you can see now on the slide is a framework for teaching mathematics in Singapore. If you look at the left part of the slide, those of you who are familiar with the problem-solving Hill model, you can immediately see the similarity, if not visually, then when you read what is written there. So mathematical problem solving, according to this framework, is about bringing the problem from the real world to the mathematical world, transforming it, bringing it back to the real world. And actually the process of learning mathematics is about learning to move the problem along these steps and the competencies required for that. Is it possible to do without development of thinking skills? Obviously not. So it's no longer about school mathematics being mainly about counting or developing mainly drilling skills. It's about something else. And it is clearly stated at the policy level and not only in Singapore. If we speak more specifically about the development of thinking, whether it is critical thinking or creative thinking, it has become part of curriculum, official curriculum in lots of countries. Let me give you two examples. So one comes from Australia, the other comes from the province of British Columbia in Canada. So they are speaking not just about some kind of thinking going on. So both of these places speak about specific thinking curriculum. So there is certain content under thinking. This content is conceptualized and it is described. Moreover, they're speaking about progression in mastering this content. So when you look at these circles from the British Columbia, you have different profiles. These are kind of levels. So these are about progression in how we're learning, developing particular competencies and mastering our things. And this content, so specifically about different thinking components, is actually integrated in different disciplines. So problems are being solved, and then the question is, what is the added value? So why might people be interested in investing in TRIZ? So my answer to this question is that education professionals might be interested if we speak about those problems where solutions at a reasonable level are still not obtained. So those problems where people are still working and where in most education systems, we're still not happy with the results. I've just tried to share a few examples. So the first ones come from a specific sub area when we're discussing the development of thinking skills, which is probably more relevant to the topic of the conference, at least as it is formulated. Yes, so TRIZ for the development of creative and critical thinking. So I see three problems here. So one is at the policy level, the problem of description of the thinking curriculum. So when we speak about the development of thinking, what are we discussing? So if we want to come up with a systemic description of thinking curriculum, this is where TRIZ can be helpful. So using TRIZ, we can do it. However, there is one big but. I think that when we look at it from the point of view of education, we need not TRIZ as such, but we need educational technologies build upon TRIZ. So here I would refer you to what Alan Nesterenko discussed earlier, TRIZ as an applied theory. So applied theory which helps education professionals develop these sets of tools or technologies. So, and these can help us with the problems which you can see on the slide. So the first one, describing the thinking curriculum. The second problem, which is very topical and still unresolved in education, when we develop a thinking curriculum, how we assess thinking. How do we know that someone has actually mastered certain thinking skills and has become a more proficient thinker? So this is another area where investment in a TRIZ-based approach may be helpful. A third one is integration. So because we still have traditional content, we can't just continue bringing new things into education because we can't stretch content. So we need to think about effective and efficient integration models. So how we can integrate the development of thinking with traditional curricular disciplines is still an open question. At a more general level, the question of organizing interdisciplinary learning is a topical problem. So if we go beyond specifically developing thinking skills, in fact, the problem education is very much discussing is how we can build a dynamic, inclusive curriculum. So everyone understands that the modern curriculum should be dynamic. It can no longer remain static. Everyone understands that it should be inclusive and people are very different. However, how we can make it dynamic and inclusive, the answer is still not clear. And all these problems obviously exist at different levels. And when we speak about lower levels, so like specific teachers or even specific schools or specific classrooms, then it's very easy to be novel. It's very easy to find teachers or schools where they're still not discussing thinking, or they still don't know what an open-ended problem is. However, if we go up and if we become a little bit more ambitious and we are no longer discussing separate schools, but we want to introduce a change at a country level, at the level of many countries, and the modern education as well as modern world is very much international, then I think, again, coming back to what I said earlier, we have to accept that we are part of this mainstream education system, which is actually discussing things which are very similar to what we are speaking about. Let me give you a few examples of what possible returns might be if we invest into educational technologies which are based on TRIZ. I'll give you a few examples from what I've been doing with my colleagues, because this is obviously something I know better than I know something else. So one of the things which I've been doing for a very long time, together with colleagues, we've been developing what we call the thinking approach to language teaching and learning. You actually have the QR codes for the website. So if you're interested in looking at the websites, you can just scan the code and you'll open the website. So the first websites describe the approach. So this is an approach to language teaching and learning, which provides for an integrated development of language and thinking skills. So it comprises a number of educational technologies, and we've been using it and sharing it with people over the world for quite some time. More specifically, what you can see on the right part of the slide is one particular technology within the thinking approach. This is a technology for dealing with grammar. So within the thinking approach, when we are learning about the grammar of the language we want to learn, we actually doing it by writing a grammar of that language. So the technology builds a process in such a way that we are writing the grammar of the language we're learning, so and see it as a problem-solving process. Another example, so the next website gives you an example of how we're working with teachers. So this was the next step. We started with languages. So about 10 years ago, a little bit more, even 12 years ago, we started working with teachers of different disciplines and develop, again, educational technologies of how we can integrate the subject matter of different disciplines with thinking, the development of thinking skills. And you can see, again, some examples. And on the right side of the slide, you have some examples of what I referred to earlier, the problem of assessment. So how tools for assessing thinking skills might look like. For example, you can find specific examples of assessment tools we can use for assessing learners' questions, where one of the key criteria behind the quality question is problem-centeredness of the question. So you have it in English, so you can open and take a look. In fact, you have it in Russian as well on that particular website. I also wanted to refer you to some of the materials you can find on the websites maintained by Alan Nesterenko and her team. And although the websites are in Russian, with a modern technology and different electronic translators, you can get actually quite a lot from reading the description of approaches, especially on the gelproj.org website, the right part of the website. And again, you have the QR code, which is a library of different publications where you have lots of papers about using TRIZ-based technologies in education. And some of the examples which Alan Nesterenko gave you, you can find a more detailed description in those publications. So to sum up, the OECD Learning Compass, something I referred to earlier, you can see it on the slide. And again, at the question of values, and there was this question in the chat about sustainable development goals and the TRIZ approach. And I wrote that I believe that we are very much in harmony, because I think that at the level of values, we share quite a lot. So they're definitely not contradictory. And I think that the added value of TRIZ-based approaches can be in adjusting, basically, in improving the navigation potential of that compass. We can actually help people be more instrumental in doing some of the things they're doing. But I don't think that we should be positioning ourselves as people who are after something different. We're not after something different. What we're speaking about is very much in line with what education is speaking about nowadays, but we can provide specific instrumental things for doing some of the things. And here is where our value is, in my opinion. So questions and comments are welcome if we still have the time. And I thank you, at least all those of you who are still here. It's quite late, especially in some parts of the world, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are some.
Yes, please.